Good morning. We'll be talking about Chapter 14 today from AP US History, the AMSCO textbook. Chapter 4 covers the Civil War, the Union or the North versus the Confederacy versus the South, 1861 to 1865. A reminder that last chapter, in Chapter 13, we talked about the variety of causes of the Civil War, stretching really all the way back to 1820 with the Missouri Compromise. And then as the US continued to expand, as the US acquired more and more territory from the Louisiana Purchase, from the Mexican-American War, and then as these territories began to turn into states, the question every time was, will these states be free or slave? We saw compromises in 1820, compromise of 1850 that tried to maintain this stability and balance between free and slave states, but the problem was always simmering in the background. And so it's perhaps no surprise that when Abraham Lincoln, the Republican candidate for president, when he won the presidential election in 1860, 4 months later, when he was inaugurated in March of 1861, the South had already seceded, South Carolina first, and then about 10 other states. So we're looking at the war itself. When Lincoln delivered his inaugural address when he was inaugurated in March of 1861, the Civil War had essentially already begun because the southern states had already seceded or left the Union. Lincoln famously in his inauguration said, "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors." You can see here that his goal is clearly to keep the Union together. His goal is clearly to avoid civil war or to solve civil war, but he's also kind of saying it's up to you. Also, not in this inaugural address, but Abraham Lincoln also promised the South that he was not going to end slavery. We'll explore in class, Abraham Lincoln's ideas on slavery were quite complex, but he was not an abolitionist. He was not trying to abolish slavery. His goal, his number one goal, was to keep the Union together, to keep the United States united. Although he wasn't quite so fortunate in doing that, at least during his lifetime, I suppose, because the Civil War began in the first month of his presidency. So Fort Sumter was a federal fort owned by the Union in South Carolina. You can see Fort Sumter right here on the coast of South Carolina. Obviously, that is in the South or in the Confederacy. So Fort Sumter was owned by the federal government, but South Carolina had seceded from the Union, had left the Union. Fort Sumter only had enough provisions, only had enough food for 1861, and so Lincoln tries to send some provisions, food, supplies, not soldiers, not weapons necessarily, but supplies. The South saw this as an act of aggression, and so on April 12th, 1861, the South fired first. The South fired the first shots of the Civil War at Fort Sumter. No lives were lost, but the Union lost Fort Sumter. It went into Southern possession, and this was truly the start of the Civil War. Fort Sumter became a rallying cry for the North, as they started to realize, well, the South, they mean business. They're not just trying to secede from the Union. They're trying to take all of our things and attack our people. And so the North, after this attack on Fort Sumter, the North began to build up their army. Lincoln, while Congress was not even in session, sent out the army. Some people viewed this as a unfair expansion of presidential power, which is the theme that we'll see with Lincoln during the Civil War. And so when we talk about the causes of the Civil War, Fort Sumter, South Carolina attacks the fort, and this forces Lincoln to create a Union army. Now, we're going to spend a lot of time digging into the North versus the South. You can see the Union, they're the dark blue. Territories of the light blue. The Confederacy, or the South, is the orange, and then the border states are the yellow. That's Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and West Virginia. The border states were still a part of the Union. They're still part of the North, but they allowed slavery. And this was important strategically to Lincoln for a handful of reasons. First of all, it provided a buffer between the North and the South. And sorry. And then secondly, there are also a handful of strategic waterways, specifically the Mississippi River running right through here along Missouri. So due to its geographic location and then strategic importance because of the river, it was important to hold on to that land. Lincoln was already not an abolitionist. He did not want to abolish slavery. But these border states, keeping the border states happy, which remember allowed slavery, was just one more reason for Lincoln to maintain slavery, to not fight to end slavery. And so I just want to clarify here, I don't know if this fits under a cause or not. So Lincoln's goal is to keep the Union together. His goal is not to end slavery, because partially he knows that he needs to keep the border states happy. Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and West Virginia. All right, spending a lot of time digging into the North and the South, their strengths and weaknesses. The South, the Confederacy, their biggest strength is that they had incredibly strong military leaders. Even to this day, the Confederacy military leaders are hailed as heroes with statues, at least in the South. Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson are the two most famous. So incredibly successful, brilliant military generals. The South also had some Native Americans join their ranks. Remember, there were a lot of Native American reservations in the South. Think of the Trail of Tears, that was in Georgia, Florida, Oklahoma. And also perhaps the Native Americans wanted to fight against the Union because the Union forced them off their land. And they were also fighting on the defensive, oftentimes fighting on their own home turf, if you will, which maybe gave them an advantage. So we talk about our strengths. We have strong military generals. Some names to know: Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. And then the support of some Native Americans. And then kind of fighting on home soil, if you will. The weaknesses of the South, though, have to do with the fact that, remember, the South was not industrialized. And they also didn't have a strong transportation system. So you can imagine they're not going to have enough shoes, they're not going to have enough uniforms, not going to have enough weaponry, for example. So the fact that they're not industrialized, weak transportation, that's going to lead to a shortage of supplies. They also had a much smaller population. You'll see there, if you look at the numbers, the North had 22 million people, the South had 9 million, but only 5.5 million were white. So smaller population. And then they did also have a weak leader in Jefferson Davis. We'll explore in a little bit that the South was all about states' rights, which if you're trying to fight a war is not the best thing in the world. The North, on the other hand, their strengths, well, the North is, remember, they're industrialized. They have all of the might of industrial America behind them. So all of the railroads, not all of, but most of the railroads, most of the wealth is in the North. They also controlled the sea, and so they're able to do a naval blockade. You might remember that New England, way back in the beginning, they were known for shipbuilding. And so the North is able to create a blockade of southern ports. They also have a larger population. They have a strong leader in Lincoln. And they also have a strong central government. Which, again, if you're fighting a war, if you need to coordinate movements and manufacturing across the entire country, having a strong central government is important. Weaknesses, though, they had weaker military officers. They didn't have the brilliant military leaders like the South did, and then not prepared for military life. The North was used to urban living in factories, not ready for military life. And so the South, they rebranded themselves the Confederate States of America, and they modeled much of their constitution on the US Constitution, but with some obvious changes, namely slavery. First, with the executive branch, they had a president, President Jefferson Davis, but they gave him only one 6-year term rather than 4-year terms. They also gave the president the opportunity to do an item veto, which meant that he doesn't have to veto an entire law, but he could just cross out one section of a law. Gives the president more powers. The legislative branch was a lot weaker, though. The legislative branch was not allowed to raise tariffs and could not raise funds for internal improvements like roads and canals and things like that. So the legislative branch was intentionally weaker, at least economically. Now, remember, this might make sense. Think about how upset like South Carolina was with the Tariff of Abominations back in the 1830s. So it makes sense that the South would not want to have high tariffs. But if you're fighting a war, that's less tax money. That's not good. Confederacy in general was all about strong state government, weak federal government, which again, for states' rights, cool, I guess. But if you're fighting a war against your more industrialized neighbor, you're going to want to have a strong federal government. That's going to weaken you quite a bit. So the Confederate States of America, again, some other possible weaknesses. Their Congress could not raise tariffs or fund for transportation, already a weakness of theirs. And then again, they resisted, or they had a strong state rights, so also a weak federal government, which is going to really handicap the South from the start. In terms of who fought the war, you'll see it was almost all volunteer soldiers on both sides. Although in 1863 the North did pass a draft, a federal conscription law that would draft all able-bodied men. Now you can see that if you were rich enough, you could pay for a replacement. $300 would get somebody to replace you, and so the draft was quite controversial. It led to a riot in New York of people who did not want to be drafted and were upset at the inequality of the draft. They also had people who would go to Western Europe and recruit Europeans to fight in the war. These were oftentimes drunkards and criminals who were just looking for a payday. So in the end, 90% of the Union Army was volunteer. The South as well, they relied mainly on volunteers, although you see they shifted to the draft in 1862 around the same time as the Union. But your wealthy slave owners were exempt from fighting in the war. If you owned more than 20 slaves, you did not have to fight. So with both of these, we are seeing, so 90% volunteer army. And then in the South, again, mostly volunteer army. But large slave owners were exempt. And same thing here. But the wealthy were exempt, or they could be exempt if they wanted to pay their way out. It's a trend in American history of the poor working class having to carry the burden of war. Now, this was a civil war between the North and the South, but the British were involved as well. And what we'll see here is that Britain did not officially take a side, but at the beginning they were pro-Confederacy, I suppose. A couple of key things that illustrate this. First, the Trent Affair. The Trent Affair was a Union warship that was sailing in the Caribbean north of Cuba, and they stopped a British ship. Now, this British ship was going from the South, going from the Confederacy to Europe with a couple of diplomats. So the Union stops this British ship, confiscates or arrests these two Confederate diplomats that were bound for Europe. That led to a whole diplomatic crisis with England, where England was pissed off that we had stopped a British ship. So eventually Lincoln released those two diplomats. But it kind of shows an early conflict between the North and England. England also built ships for the Confederacy. Now, these were not technically warships because when they were sent from England to the South, they didn't have weapons on them. But England knew what they were going to be used for. For the South, this was important because remember, the South was not as industrialized, didn't have factories, so they did rely on England for those warships. Although, just to clarify, even though England sent ships to the South, England never officially allied with the Confederacy. And we'll see a few slides later, England eventually is going to back off. But important to add, the South had some support from England. They bought ships from them, but they were not formal allies. All right, now back over to the North. So Abraham Lincoln, the Republican president of the North, ruling with a stronger federal government, and he's going to seek to make that federal government even stronger. And what that meant was limiting people's individual freedoms during wartime. This is something that we see throughout history. We'll see it in World War II. We see it in the War on Terror, if you will, today, with something called the Patriot Act. First of all, Abraham Lincoln, when he went to war against the South in April of 1861, Congress was not in session. Congress was not in session when the South seceded. Congress was not in session when Lincoln sent the first troops. And so a lot of what Lincoln did early on in the war was without Congress's approval. It was the president taking more power for himself. So his blockade of southern ports, that was a presidential decision. His increase of the size of the federal army, that was a presidential decision. He also most famously and perhaps most controversially suspended the writ of habeas corpus. Writ of habeas corpus literally in Latin translates to "where is the body?" or "show me the body." It basically means if you are going to be arrested for a crime, there has to be proof. You got to show me the body that I killed to arrest me. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which basically meant he could arrest people with no evidence. So Abraham Lincoln used that to arrest anti-unionists, potential spies in the North. And then he also held supervised elections in the border states, which is controversial, but also he's making sure that the border states do not secede. So Lincoln expanded the power of the federal government and the president. So he sent out the army without Congress's permission. The big one is that he suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which meant, again, that he could arrest people without evidence. All right, continuing to dig into the North and the South, and we're going to keep that T chart there. The Northern economy is still humming, it's still doing well. And a lot of this was because of increased taxes. You see there was an increased tax on tobacco and alcohol. There were also increased tariffs, just by 5 to 10%, so a moderate amount. And they also printed paper money called greenbacks. This is going to be something that we'll talk about later, where the U.S. shifts away from the gold-based economy by printing paper money, and the value fluctuated. So the economy kind of varies in terms of its strength, but generally, having paper money allowed for kind of a more stable economy. Lincoln also launched a national bank system. Remember, way back in the 1830s, Andrew Jackson vetoed that charter of the Bank of the U.S. So Lincoln kind of brings that back. This was to sell government bonds to raise money and to have one currency for all states, all in the Union. And this exists until 1913, when it'll be replaced by something called the Federal Reserve System. It does the same thing, basically maintaining a stable, consistent economy. And the biggest effect that we have of all of these taxes and a more stable economy with the national bank system is that Northern industry is booming. Northern industry is exploding in a good way. And we have our first millionaires in American history. These factories created all of the military supplies that were needed to fight the war. They discovered petroleum, oil, in 1859 in Pennsylvania. That's going to lead to another boom as well. So the Northern economy booms during the war. Part of that is because we have increased tariffs, which protect new factories. And then we have a national bank system, which provides stability, sells bonds. Now, another interesting point about the Civil War is that women actually served in the war, both as soldiers and in factories. So when men went into military service, the women took their jobs. This is a common trend that we'll see in World War I and World War II as well. But many women entered the military as well. Sometimes they would pose as male soldiers. Sometimes they would go as doctors or nurses. Sometimes they would disguise themselves as men, kind of Mulan style. And the first woman doctor in the US actually organized a commission to train future nurses, to collect medical supplies, and to create hospitals for the Union. And so women really played a crucial role in the Civil War. I don't really know where to put this. It doesn't go as a cause or as an effect. So we'll just say, I don't know. Other details, I don't really know. So women served on both sides, especially as nurses. And that's going to kind of set a foundation for women doing similar things in later wars. Now, for some key characters, Abraham Lincoln is the main leader you got to know in the North, along with Ulysses S. Grant, who will become president later on, and William Sherman, who is a general that we'll meet later. Their capital was in D.C. And then the South and the Confederacy, we already know about Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, those two military leaders. And then their much weaker president, Jefferson Davis. They were based in Richmond, Virginia. Now, pausing for a second, looking at this map here, again, the blue states are the North. You can see California and Oregon fought for the Union. And then these border states in the middle, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware. Remember, those border states are so important because they kind of maintained a buffer between the North and the South. You've also got the Mississippi River running along the borders of Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, Arkansas, down to Louisiana. So having having access to the Mississippi River for the Union allows them to transport supplies. And then the Atlantic Ocean. Remember, the North has all of the shipbuilding industries, and so a lot of what the North is doing is creating a naval blockade along the South, trying to prevent supplies from reaching to the South. So we can already kind of see some Northern strategy, naval blockades, controlling the waterways. All right. In addition to women serving in the Army, we also had many Black people serving in the Army as well. 180,000 African Americans served in the Union Army. That was 10% of the total Army, especially after the Emancipation Proclamation, where Lincoln promises to free the slaves. That number increases. The Confederacy did not allow Black soldiers until the very, very end of the war, when they were desperate. Now, that's not surprising. The South is fighting to protect the institution of slavery. They believe that Africans are inferior. And they kept, they actually the South was actually forced to keep many white soldiers at home to prevent slave revolts. What we'll actually see is that 500,000 slaves will eventually either rebel or flee during the war. So 500,000 slaves in the South will abandon or will escape their plantations during the war. And this leads to the collapse of the Southern economy, and eventually one of the biggest reasons why the South loses, because their economy collapses because the Souths are fleeing. Now, one of the other things that we see during the Civil War is new military technology that makes the war quite deadlier. Before the Civil War, you'd have a musket with one bullet at a time. Every single time you shoot, you got to reload it, and you could shoot about 250 yards. So armies before the Civil War would fight at close range. Think about the American Revolution. You got two rows of soldiers very close together. During the Civil War, though, there's more advanced technology because, again, this is the Industrial Revolution, after all. Rifles can now fire 1,000 yards. They could fire 7 times in 30 seconds with repeating rifles. But really only the North had access to these supplies. So because of this economic boom, the North has access to better weapons, specifically the repeating rifle. They also used hot air balloons to spy on the South. So they would send hot air balloons high up into the South to kind of observe military positions. They used the first submarines as well to spy and to sabotage Southern ships. And then we have cannons as well. Now, for the battles themselves, we're not going to spend a lot of time looking at the battles, but we'll dig into a couple of them. The first battle, the Battle of Bull Run, was a Southern victory. Lincoln expected a quick victory. He thought they were going to fight for 3 months and be over with it. But Stonewall Jackson, that's where he got his nickname, Stonewall, like a wall of stone. He's able to successfully defeat the Union by sending in reinforcements. So when we talk about our key battles, the Battle of Bull Run, this is an early Southern victory. And this leads to Southern overconfidence. They think they're going to take this easily. And it also leads to kind of a Northern focus on a tough war. They know that they're going to be in it for a while. Now, the Union strategy, as we talked about when we looked at the map, was to use the US Navy to blockade Southern ports to prevent supplies from getting to the South. The Union strategy was also to control that Mississippi River, at least as much of the Mississippi River as they could, to kind of cut the Confederacy into two. And then they raised an army of 500,000 to send to the capital. So let's say here, the Northern strategy was to do a naval blockade of the South, to control the Mississippi River, and then again to send a 500,000 strong army to conquer the capital, which was Richmond, Virginia. Now, the South, we talked about this earlier. The South originally had some business dealings with Great Britain. The Trent Affair, that was that diplomatic crisis. The Confederate raiders, those were those British-made ships that the South got. But ultimately, England ends up backing off. England ends up backing off of giving the South support because they realized the South wasn't going to win. Britain basically realized that the South was not strong enough economically to win. Sometimes it's called the failure of cotton diplomacy. Cotton diplomacy meaning the South was going to use the strength of their cotton industry to win the war. But as slaves flee their plantations and as the South is forced to fight a war, they're not able to produce as much cotton, their economy tanks, and so the South backs off. Another one of the key battles is Antietam, which you can see had massive casualties on both sides. In just the morning, there were 43,000 casualties, 20,000 on the Confederate side. And so if you look at the numbers here, which army suffered the most casualties during the battle? It looks like the Union had, let's see, about 13,000 casualties, and the Confederacy had about 10,000. But the Union also had much more soldiers fighting. They had, 46,000 soldiers fighting, whereas the Confederacy had about 35,000. So Antietam, it looks like the Union had more casualties than they did, but they also had more soldiers. So Antietam in 1862 was a decisive defeat for the Confederacy. They were super close to conquering DC, and was a moral victory for the Union. This other battle here, sorry. Antietam in 1862. It's a decisive victory for the Union. It's a moral victory as well. And it leads to the Union kind of taking a bolder stance. So it leads to the Union fighting to now end slavery. We'll see the Emancipation Proclamation in a moment. And it becomes much more of a moral war. The border states also officially joined the Union side after Antietam because they realized the North is probably going to win the war. And so after this military victory at Antietam, Lincoln begins to wonder whether he should end slavery or not. Now, this was a question he'd already been thinking about. Originally, when Lincoln ran for president in 1860 and then at the start of the Civil War, Lincoln was not going to end slavery. He needed the support of the border states. He also thought that the Constitution protected slavery. Think about Dred Scott versus Stanford that said slaves were property. And a lot of Northerners were very racist. They still had racial prejudices. And remember, Northerners benefited from slavery with the economic profit they were making from the slave trade, or sorry, not the slave trade, but from agriculture and plantations. And then Lincoln was also just worried that if he did too much too quickly, the next election he would lose, and the other side would just change everything that he did. Ultimately, enslaved Africans or enslaved peoples are freed during the Civil War, sometimes through military events, victories like Antietam and the Civil War, sometimes through government policy like the Emancipation Proclamation, or more so the 13th Amendment, and then also through their own actions of slaves rebelling and fleeing from their plantations and joining the Union to fight. So let's see, I'm going to put this in the North. Actually, no, I'm not. I'm going to put this in other details. Lincoln originally did not want to end slavery. He needed the border states. There was racism, and then there was this fear that it would be overturned. But he eventually fights to abolish slavery. And I'm going to say this after some military victories, after he realizes that maybe he can win the war and free slavery. And so famously, Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation on New Year's Day in 1863. After the Battle of Antietam, after the Union won, Lincoln felt the Union was strong enough that he could take kind of a bolder stance on slavery. This is the famous speech 77 years ago that we'll read about when we come back from Thanksgiving break. And the Emancipation Proclamation specifically stated that all slaves in rebel states are free. Rebel states meaning the South. The Emancipation Proclamation is a super important document in U.S. history because it is the president of the U.S. saying we are going to free slaves. But caveat number one, this did not free slaves in the border states. Remember, the border states are fighting for the Union. Lincoln needs them on his side. So he doesn't even touch them. So it doesn't actually end slavery in the border states. And then secondly, Lincoln didn't even have the power to do this. The rebel states, the South, the Confederacy, they're fighting a civil war against him. And so the Emancipation Proclamation is symbolic, certainly, but it doesn't actually do anything. Let me add a date here for Antietam. So Lincoln frees, I'll put freeze in quotation marks, all slaves in rebel states. But again, this is not in the border states. He still needs their support. And again, Lincoln, this has no effect because Lincoln cannot actually do that because they're rebelling against him. So again, much more a symbolic message rather than an actual physical change. Another one of the key battles is the Battle of Gettysburg, which in American lore and mythology is one of the most important. Robert E. Lee of the South, he tried to invade the North through Pennsylvania to either destroy the army or capture a major northern city. And the South lost. So Gettysburg was kind of it wasn't necessarily a last gasp attempt by the South, but it was a much riskier play by the South deep into Northern territory. And after the South loses at Gettysburg, they're going to be retreating the rest of the war. They're never going to have the offensive again. And so Gettysburg, if we're talking about key battles that are kind of a turning point, Gettysburg's one of them. So the South fails to conquer Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And this is going to be a turning point because the South is now on the defensive for the rest of the war. A turning point for them from a military perspective. Now, the Civil War was the deadliest war in American history up until that point, and I believe it might still be the deadliest war. I can't remember if World War II surpassed the Civil War as our deadliest war. You can see Gettysburg was the deadliest battle of the Civil War, 51,000 people dead on both sides. But the bloodiest day, the bloodiest single day, if you look in closer, it looks like Antietam. was the bloodiest single day. And remember the size of the armies. The Union had 500,000 soldiers. And so when we're looking at these numbers, these are huge numbers of casualties, huge numbers of deaths on both sides. After the Northern victory, after the Union victory at Gettysburg, it was quite clear the North was going to win. The South could have sued for peace. Lincoln could have sued for peace as well. But instead, the North decided to really come down with an iron fist and win a decisive, brutal victory. And a lot of that is through something called Sherman's March. William T. Sherman was a Union general who marched all the way into the South. You can see they're going all the way into South Carolina, deep into Southern territory. And Sherman's march to the sea was sometimes it's called a total war. Sometimes it's called a war of attrition, meaning Sherman is trying to wipe out everything that the South has. He destroys railroads as he marches. He burns buildings. He destroys homes. He destroys supplies. And the goal here was to just completely crush the morale of the South, to take the war to the citizens that weren't fighting, to force them to give up. I've got my history on this day calendar. Y'all probably can't see it very well, but on this day, well, okay, technically yesterday, on this day was when the Union, was when Sherman began his march to the South in 1864. So again, this is known as Sherman's March. This is in 1864. The Union, led by William Sherman, marches deep into the South, and they destroy railroads, homes, plantations, supplies as they go, really burning everything to the ground. And the goal here was to destroy Southern morale, to make them have no more will to fight anymore. And again, this is sometimes called either a total war or a war of attrition. War of attrition means to basically make it so that they have to give up because they have no more supplies or no more food left. And so the Civil War ultimately does end as a battle of attrition. The South gives up because they can't fight anymore. They don't have enough supplies or enough men. The Union, they lost 10% of their army. They are able to attack multiple Southern armies at the same time. Meanwhile, the South, led by Robert E. Lee, they lost much more. They lost 20% of their men. They also, remember, didn't have the factories to produce more supplies. They just tried to escape. So the North ultimately captures Richmond, Virginia in April 1865, forces Robert E. Lee to surrender, and unofficially ending the war. So the war ends at Appomattox, if I'm pronouncing that right. I need to spell it right. Where the North forces Robert E. Lee to surrender. Now, when we talk about the legacy of the Civil War is one of the defining moments of American history. I mean, 1619 with slavery, 1776 with independence, 1865 with the Civil War. Those are probably three turning points in American history. 750,000 Americans died. That's 2% of the American population. For comparison's sake, in World War II, 500,000 Americans died. So deadliest war still in American history. They also, the U.S. also had $15 billion in damage and property losses. So devastating effects of the war. Also some political, economic, and social effects. Politically, we see an increase in the size of the federal government with the draft, with the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, which allowed Lincoln to arrest people without evidence. And what we really see is that the federal government is now supreme. The federal government now has power over the states. And then ultimately what we'll get to when we get to Chapter 15, Reconstruction, slavery will finally be abolished with the 13th Amendment. For economic changes, actually, I'm going to pause here and add some notes to here. So we're talking about the effects of the Civil War from a political perspective. Spell it right. The federal government gained immense powers. For example, the draft, getting rid of habeas corpus, and then eventually the 13th Amendment. For economic effects, we see again the federal government playing a much bigger role in economics by increasing tariffs, by printing paper money, and by building this national bank system that will become the Federal Reserve 60 years later. So the federal government, again, plays a bigger role. They have bonds, they have tariffs, and they have the national bank system. The federal government under Lincoln also passed several acts to raise tariffs, the Morrill Tariff Act, to encourage people to settle in the Great Plains, the Homestead Act, to build a transcontinental railroad, Pacific Railway Act, and then to create colleges that will focus on technical skills, the Morrill Land Grant. And so let's see here, how am I going to put this? Laws encouraged settlement in the West, railroads, and new colleges, let's say. So that's going to lead to future economic growth. So even while Lincoln's fighting a war, he's strengthening the economy. And then social changes, well, we have women that would work in factories and they would fight during the war. We have the end of slavery, ultimately, which we'll get to in chapter 15. 4 million people freed from slavery, 3.5 million from the Confederacy, 500,000 from the border states. And then I am going to add here, 750,000 die, 2% of the population. It's the most deadly war we've ever had, and $15 billion in damage. The last moment to end with, Lincoln's last drama, is Lincoln's assassination before the war could finally end. Lincoln was attending a play at the Ford Theater in DC, and he was killed by John Wilkes Booth, who was a Southern actor who was just a kind of an obsessed Southerner. John Wilkes Booth snuck into the spot where Lincoln and his family was watching the play, shot him from behind, and then jumped onto the stage, broke his leg, and was eventually captured soon after. The war was already over, or was essentially already over. And so after Lincoln was killed, the North was even more upset, even more angry at the South. Like, not only did we beat you, not only, you know, the North clearly won, both militarily and morally, but now you killed our president. And so this is probably going to lead to a kind of a bitter response by the North. They're going to be much more harsh maybe to the South than they might have been. Now, on the other side, Lincoln's kind of premature death does kind of preserve his legacy as the great emancipator, as the one who freed the slaves. He didn't have to deal with the messy business of rebuilding the country after Civil War. That was left to Andrew Johnson, his vice president. So we'll end here with the assassination of Lincoln in April 1865. And again, we've got Lincoln's legacy as the great emancipator, but this increases Northern anger at the South. And so, like always, if y'all need to pause here, we've got the causes and then the North versus the South. Again, biggest thing to remember, the North is industrialized. That gives them a huge advantage by having more supplies, by having more troops, and by being able to do a naval blockade. The North also has that stronger federal government that helps. Some more details down here. Remember, when the North originally fought the war, their goal was to preserve the Union, not to abolish slavery. We've got these key battles of the war. Early Southern victory, but eventually the North gains a huge advantage The Emancipation Proclamation, one of those key turning points in the war, where the Civil War becomes not just a war to preserve the Union, but a moral crusade against the immoral slavery. And then both Sherman's march, crushing the South, and then the assassination of Lincoln is really going to lead to a kind of bitter period after the Civil War known as Reconstruction.